1989 will go down in history, as tensions in China have risen and resulted in a violation of human rights. For our viewers who have not been following the current situation in China, here's a brief recap. Until the end of the 19th century, China was considered to be within the sphere of British influence. However, several nationalist movements arose, and consequently, British control decreased. A government was created through what we refer to as the Chinese Revolution. The emperor was overthrown, and the Kuomintang was established. This democratic government sought to remove foreign influence, increase individual rights, initiate land reform, and achieve modernization. The Kuomintang was led by Jiang Jieshi. The Kuomintang was in constant opposition to the Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong. Mao, along with 100,000 supporters, was forced to retreat from the Kuomintang in 1934 in what became known as the Long March. During the march, supporters walked nearly 6,000 miles. The march was used by Mao and the Communist Party to strengthen their opposition towards the democratic government and rise to power. Despite having lost nearly 80% of his supporters, Mao was relentless and continued his fight against the government. He eventually succeeded in 1949. He then established a communist government, the government in China today. Mao has used a series of tactics and programs to consolidate his power since then. He transformed China's agricultural society into an industrial society. Through what is known as the Great Leap Forward, the state has come to control politics and economics. The system has sought to increase Chinese industrial output by creating communes. These communes are similar to those implemented in the Soviet Union, and similarly as to what we've seen in the USSR, the collectivization in China has resulted in famine and shortages of consumer goods. Another tactic currently used by Mao is the distribution of Mao's Little Red Book. Mao has controlled the education of school children to consolidate and strengthen his power. His Little Red Book is required reading, which pushes communist ideas onto the rising generation. Even older generations are forced into schools which teach only communist ideas. Confucianism and Taoism are banned in China. Any opposition to the Communist Party has been put down harshly, but nothing as harsh as what we've seen today. In the 1950s, Mao's opponents began to demand change. As a result, Mao unleashed the Red Guard. The Red Guard consists mainly of students who attack any who dare to speak out against the Communist Party. This has become known as the Cultural Revolution. Mao has sought to eliminate any of his opponents through beatings, terror, and mass jailings. This has resulted in the death of thousands in China. Pro-democracy protesters have gathered in Tiananmen Square for several weeks now, and although tensions between the Chinese government and the demonstrators have been high, nobody expected the violation of human rights that happened today. Today, the protest was put down brutally, and although hospitals have been ordered to remain silent about the number of casualties, several reports indicate that many Chinese people died. The Chinese government has not released a statement presently, but stay tuned for any developments.
The 20th and 21st century history of Iran. Reza Shah was brought onto the lead of Iran in 1925, ruling until 1941. His government focused on nationalism, militarism, and secularism. His reforms were resented among devout Muslims as they were seen as a departure from religious tradition. Mosques were often required to use chairs, men were required to wear Western clothing and brimmed hats, and women were encouraged to discard the hijab. Tensions in Iran were high in 1935, when Reza Shah was forced to suppress a rebellion in Mashdad, organized against his rule by those who compare the Shah to early Common Era dictators of Iran. Between August and September 1941, during the Second World War, Iran was invaded by Soviet and British forces during Operation Countenance, the purpose of which was to secure oil fields in Iran and ensure supply lines to Soviet forces on the Eastern Front. Reza Shah was deposed in the occupation following the invasion because of his suspected affiliation with Axis powers, despite Iran's neutral public status in the international community. Reza Shah was replaced by his son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. The Tehran Conference of 1943 stated the post-war boundaries and independence of Iran. When the war ended, Soviet troops in northwestern Iran refused to leave the nation and helped spur short-lived revolts that created temporary pro-Soviet national states, the Azerbaijan People's Government and the Republic of Kurdistan. Soviet troops would not leave until promised oil concessions by the Iranian government. After the Soviets left Iran, however, in May of 1946, the pro-Soviet states were overthrown and the concessions were revoked. Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi held power from 1941 to 1979. At first, there was hope in the international community that the new Shah would run a constitutional monarchy, and indeed, Pahlavi took a very hands-off role in the government of Iran, at least initially. Pahlavi convened the Iran Constituent Assembly, which formed the Senate of Iran, supportive of Pahlavi. In 1951, Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh received the required votes to nationalize Iran's British-controlled oil industry. He was briefly removed from power in 1952, but was quickly reappointed. After Mossadegh was brought back into power by the Shah in 1952, he, in return, forced the Shah Pahlavi into a brief exile in 1953. The United States and Britain headed Operation Ajax to reinstall the Shah using an anti-Mossadegh propaganda campaign to turn the population against him. Mossadegh was arrested and convicted, sentenced to house arrest, and completely stripped of his power. The Shah Pahlavi ruled again, in an autocracy with American support. Iran's most valuable natural resource, oil, was the subject of interest in Iran by a consortium of foreign companies that ran the infrastructure of Iran's oil fields for the next 25 years, taking 50% of profits. Martial law in Iran ended in 1957, and Iran joined the Baghdad Pact, beginning to receive economic and military aid from the US. Iran also initiated a series of reforms known as the Shah's White Revolution. The White Revolution, however, did little to improve the quality of living in Iran. In June of 1963, a period of rioting occurred after Ruhollah Khomeini, a cleric, was arrested for an anti-Shah speech. Within a few years, Savak, Pahlavi's internal secret police and security agency, became more active as threats and assassinations on internal regime targets increased. Iran began to increase its security budget and grew further from its neighbor Iraq as it increased its power over the region of the Middle East. A series of events initiated by dispute over ownership of the Shatt al-Arab waterway resulted in temporary raised tensions. In January of 1979, Reza Shah Pahlavi left the nation of Iran in exile after strikes and demonstrations began crippling the nation. Ruhollah Khomeini returned to Iran, facing massive support by the people of the nation. By April 1st of 1979, Iran was an Islamic republic under popular demand. In 1979, Khomeini was legally given the title Guardian Jurist Supreme Leader. On November 4th, 1979, Iranian students captured the United States Embassy in Iran in protest to the former Shah being admitted into the U.S. for cancer treatment. Iran rallied around the men who kidnapped 52 individuals found at the embassy, increasing Ruhollah Khomeini's prestige and hold on power in Iran. For support, Khomeini, at this time, began referring to the U.S. as Great Satan, spurring anti-American feelings in Iran, in turn begetting anti-Iranian feelings in America. Even after the prisoners were released during Reagan's inaugural speech, 444 days after their capture, these antagonist feelings continued to affect both nations greatly. During this political and social crisis of 1980, Saddam Hussein decided to act on his chance to secure a place of power in the Middle East for Iraq. Khuzestan in Iran boasted a surplus of oil fields and served as the location by which Iraq invaded. In the ensuing 8-year war, between 500,000 and 1 million Iranians were killed, over 100,000 of them by chemical weapons. In 1988, the conclusion of the war, the Iranian government systematically executed thousands of political prisoners in the nation over a period of 5 months. Khomeini ruled as the supreme leader of Iran until his death on June 3, 1989. On his deathbed, Khomeini appointed a 25-man Constitutional Reform Council, which named Ali Khamenei as Khomeini's successor. Khomeini was less of a personal figure and was said to run what resembled a clerical oligarchy. Succeeding Khamenei was Ali Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, who tried to improve Iran's economy and infrastructure. Rafsanjani served 2 terms, for a total of 8 years as the leader of Iran. The next leader was Mohammad Khatami, whose attempts at reform were met with opposition. In 2005, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was elected as Iran's 5th president. Finally, in 2005, Ahmadinejad was re-elected despite crippling protests. thanks for watching a summary of Iran's 20th century and early 21st century history. Action.
Hi, welcome to the Apartheid News Recap, starring Fred Flevick. So, a lot of you are asking, Fred, what's the Apartheid? I have no idea what that is, because no, we never learned about it in any classes. Well, no, we have learned about it in any classes. That's what I'm here for, to give you the news recap of the Apartheid. So, our Apartheid starts in South Africa, the country farthest south in Africa. In 1948, the South African government installed a system of laws that would be called the Apartheid laws, which would legally separate whites and blacks into practically everything. Imagine, you would never ever see a white person and a black person in the same place. Sounds kind of mean. It was. It was very unfair. During the South African Apartheid, countless of blacks were exiled. The goal of the government was not to kill the blacks. No, the primary focus was solely to exile the blacks to their homeland, even though the whites were the minorities of European descendants, Dutch and other sorts, who weren't from the homeland, while the blacks were South Africans of tradition who were in their own homeland. So they were practically being kicked out of their very own country. During the Apartheid, this man right here, Nelson Mandela, I'm sure you know his name, he has recently passed away, was one of the fighters who formed the African National Congress. The African National Congress fought all around Africa to try to end the Apartheid, which brings me to my next point, world recognition. The world really didn't even recognize the Apartheid. Ronald Reagan did set out a point to say to stop trading with South Africa and that it was wrong, but no one really did anything. Men like Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress were the true reason as to why the Apartheid was eventually ended in the year 1994. Now, why has Nelson Mandela become the most famous man, most likely of the Apartheid? Because Nelson Mandela would become the first president of a democratic nation of South Africa. Of course, F.W. de Klerk in 1990 did start to slowly decrease the effects of the Apartheid and eventually did lead to Nelson Mandela being elected. But Nelson Mandela is the landmark in what every news covered. That's what I want to focus on, because every news channel covered just the ending of the Apartheid. No one covered the actual Apartheid and all of the violation of rights that were going on during the Apartheid. Now, in the Apartheid, people were literally being pulled over for no reason. You're walking on the street going to get lunch. What, you're black? Oh, you gotta go. You would be kicked out of South Africa, tortured, beaten, countless things, even if you didn't do anything. You could have been standing near a white person, and you could have gotten in trouble just for that. Now, after the Apartheid ends, the news likes to cover that. Oh, Mandela's the president. Oh, yay, South Africa's such a cheery mood. What we want to remember about the Apartheid is all the actual violation of rights that it did cause. Now, this is a flag representing the Apartheid, and as you can see, there is a part of Great Britain in the flag right there. So the purpose of using this flag during that time was so that all people of the Apartheid thought that we are actually European, even if they weren't, even if they were from South Africa. They believed themselves to be the Europeans, the better. And this resulted in the people supporting the Apartheid almost within their own country. So the South Africans were for the Apartheid. That's something we have to remember. Even if they act all, after once Mandela gets elected, they do come to realize this is very wrong. During the actual Apartheid, from the time span of 1948 through around 1994, we'll say 1990, just an F.W. de Klerk again, South Africans the whites thought they were living in a utopia of themselves, and they separated themselves, and they had such a glamorous lifestyle. When in truth, there were countless and thousands, almost millions of blacks being exiled and tortured and beaten by their own people. So, recap, what do we have in the Apartheid? One of the largest violations of human rights solely because of race. This man, Nelson Mandela, becomes the first president of a democratic nation of South Africa in the year 1994, approximately 4 years after F.W. de Klerk started to loosen up the Apartheid. The world really didn't do anything about it. the world kind of just watched as thousands were exiled, and South Africa acted as if, oh, everything, was okay, we're just making our nation better, when in truth, they were exiling countless. And no one really did anything. So that's the point of the apartheid that we're trying to learn here, is that when the world realized this was a human violation, this can't happen again. So after the apartheid, the world then decided, well, let's do something about it, started putting in laws, that this really can't happen again. But during the apartheid, no one did anything, and that's what we remember. That's why figures like Nelson Mandela and his National African Congress were so important, because they did something in the moment. And that's why I'm recapping different news, because I could recap about the end, and I could recap about how great South Africa was after, but what we have to remember is what happened during it, and all of those who lost their rights, and all of those who lost freedom.
Hello, welcome to History 101. Tonight we have a special brought to you by our news anchor Akimi Sasaki about the Meiji Restoration in Japan.
So before the Meiji Restoration, we have what's known as the Edo period. So let's take a look at the social structure in Edo, Japan, or also known as the social structure under the Tokugawa shogunate. So under this system, there is a very rigid class structure. We have the emperor, the shogun, the daimyo, the samurai, the farmers, the artisans, and the merchants. So an acronym, in order to memorize the order of this, is, well, first picture we have a lion. So lion makes that noise, roar. So everyone's like, let's shoot it with a gun. So the shogun. Then we have, everyone's like, yo, let's stop. So that's the daimyo. And then they're like, let's just call the samurai. And so they call in the samurai, and everyone's one big happy fam. Hence, farmers, artisans, and merchants. So belief systems under this were Shintoism, which you might remember from last year. And so basically the beliefs in this were animism, which said all things have spirits, and this is known as kami. And there's a picture of the Yasukuni Shrine. So that's a famous shrine that's under the water on like the lake. And so that basically shows the values of Shintoism and basically the respect for nature. So this is very similar to Taoism in China, and that is why there's a picture of a yin-yang. So the other belief system in Japan was Buddhism. And Buddhism focused on the middle path, or the Eightfold Path, that said to take the middle path towards seeking nirvana, the Four Noble Truths, and it was founded by Siddhartha Gautama, and it believed in meditation and reincarnation as well as karma. Slightly before the Meiji Restoration, we have what's called the Opium Wars. So this is a war between China and Britain. In the early 1800s, British treasury was depleted because the British were very dependent on Chinese importation of tea. So China was still considered to be a middle kingdom. This is because they were ethnocentric and they had feelings of xenophobia, meaning they were fearful of outsiders and they thought that their society or culture was dominant than the rest of the world. In order to resolve this imbalance of trade, because the British were so dependent on Chinese tea, the British decided to import poppy or opium into China. So the poppy was from the British colony of India, and so the Chinese were very upset by this because opium was very addictive and they wanted to stop any social problems that arose due to the importation of opium. So the Chinese tried to ban the importation of opium in what's known as the Opium Wars. And so the British were superior because they had better naval forces and technology. So that led them into winning the Opium Wars and establishing unequal treaties, such as the Treaty of Nanjing, which was established in 1842. So this was one of the treaties that resulted as an effect of the Opium Wars. And in this treaty, the Chinese have to reimburse Britain's costs for entering the war with China. So they have to basically pay back what the British had to pay for entering the war.
They need to open up ports to British trade, provide Britain with control over Hong Kong, and grant extraterritoriality to British citizens. So that's a policy that guarantees that European citizens that are living or residing in China will only subject to the laws of their own nations and can only be tried in their own courts. So this had an impact on Japan because Japan didn't want to fall to the British forces like China did. So they wanted to imperialize, and basically the Tokugawa shogunate was thrown down or taken over by the Meiji, and so that's known as what's called the Meiji Restoration. So then we have Matthew Commodore Perry's visit to Japan. And so him and his navy anchor at Edo or Tokyo Bay, and the Japanese had never before seen ships steaming with smoke. So they thought the ships were giant dragons of puffing smoke. They didn't know that steamboats existed and were shocked by the number and size of the guns that were on board the ships. So after coming to Japan, Matthew Perry showed the Japanese a letter that he had gotten from President Millard Fillmore to the Emperor of Japan. And basically this shows like what the US wanted Japan to do in order to like become more Western. Basically then the Japanese formed the Treaty of Kanagawa, which calls for peace and friendship between the US and Japan, opening 2 ports to American ships at Shimoda and Hakodate. And they call for any American ships wrecked on the Japanese coast to be protected. And it allows permission for American ships to buy supplies, coal, water, and other necessary things in Japanese ports. Under this time, we see a bunch of Japanese reforms after Matthew Perry's visit to Japan. So one way I like to memorize this is the word Meiji. The Japanese chocolate brand Meiji has a font, and so basically if you look at the last 3 letters, IJI, it looks like basically 3 people. And so that symbolizes like trade between the West, and you know it's to the West because the J points towards the West. And so there are many different reforms made under that time. And so the Emperor Meiji was moved from the city of Kyoto to Tokyo, and social classes begin to merge together, which is new because looking back at the social class system of the Tokugawa shogunate or the Edo period, it's very strict and rigid. Samurais lost all social and special privileges. Respected members of the society with a lot of power established religious toleration in Japan, which is different because we used to see Buddhism and Shintoism and rejecting Catholicism, but now things are getting integrated into Japan. We have the daimyo return all the land to the emperor. The Japanese currency system is established along with the Bank of Japan. The Japanese education system is reformed, so they took after countries such as Germany and France. Japan creates an army that models Prussia and a navy that was influenced by Britain because Britain's navy was so strong. Many Japanese scholars traveled aboard to learn about Western culture and ideas after Matthew Perry's visit because they were so inspired by Western technology and things. They created a European-style constitution in 18... They transformed from an agrarian society, which was basically a society that's very reliant on agriculture, to an industrial one. And those are all the forms of the Meiji Restoration, and thanks for watching. And I hope you learned a lot about the Meiji Restoration in Japan.
Hello, and welcome to the Advanced Placement News Network, where we're giving you the news just a lot later. Today we'll be covering the history of India from the 1600s to present day.
Throughout the 1600s until the mid-1800s, the British East Indian Company expanded until it controlled 3/5 of India. This occurred because the British had more advanced technology than India at the time. The main goal of the British East Indian Company was to make profits off the colonies placed in India. This is an example of colonialism or imperialism.
The next main event was the Sepoy Rebellion in 1857. The Sepoy Rebellion was a massacre of the British men, women, and children. The British crushed the revolt and killed thousands of unarmed Indians. Sepoys are native troops of India under the control of the British. The causes of the Sepoy Rebellion include the well-educated Indians that were being kept out of high posts in government, mercantilist policies, which is the increased exports and decreased imports colony is placed to export to, meant that Indians weren't allowed any large-scale manufacturing. Sepoys were required to serve anywhere, including overseas. Law required Hindu widows to remarry, issued new rifles to sepoys that required them to bite off the tips of cartridges that were greased with animal fat from cows, which are sacred to Hindus, or pigs, which are forbidden to Muslims. Troops who refused to load rifles were dismissed without pay.
In 1858, the British ended the rule of the East India Company and put India directly under the rule of the Crown. This resulted in the British sending more troops and Indians paying more taxes to support them. It also resulted in the British Viceroy being ruled under the name of the Queen and in British officials holding top positions in India. India also served as a market for British goods and was a source of raw materials.
There are many positives and negatives of British imperialism. Positives include improved infrastructure, especially by building railroad, improved communications, i.e. the telegraph, improved communications, and infrastructure, increased national unity. Upper-class Indians were able to send their children, mostly male, abroad to be educated in Britain. This comes back to haunt the British. Revised legal system to treat all Indians equally, although Indians did not get much help from the legal system. Medical improvements, and new farming methods.
Some of the negatives include Britain flooded India with cheap machine-made textiles, which ruined India's hand-weaving industry. Pushed farmers to grow cash crops instead of food to eat. Clearing farmland led to massive deforestation and environmental destruction. Terrible famines caused by increase in population due to medical improvements and increased food supply that could not keep up with the food supply, especially when farmland was used to grow cash crops. There was discrimination and increased tension between Hindus and Muslims.
The Indians were divided on their feelings for the British. The educated and wealthy wanted to be like the British and modernize. As a result, many wealthy Indians adopted Western culture.
In the late 1800s, Western-educated Indians, schooled in democracy and equality, became a movement to end British rule. In 1885, the Indian National Congress, INC, was formed. Members were professionals who wanted to modernize the individuals, believed independence could be achieved without violence.
In 1906, the Muslim League formed when tensions increased between the Muslims and the Hindus. Talks of a separate Muslim state occurred in this league.
The next main event was another massacre. The Amritsar Massacre was a tragedy every Indian knows well. On April 13, 1919, British troops fired protesters in the park of Amritsar because Indians were upset about heavy casualties in World War I, and India was promised greater self-government after the war but received only minor reforms. After the massacre, the Congress Party called for full independence.
This brings us to Mohandas Gandhi. He came from a middle-class Hindu family where he studied law in England. He joined a law firm in South Africa where he witnessed the prejudice Indians faced. For 20 years, Gandhi fought against injustice in South Africa using nonviolent resistance, AMISA. In 1914, he returned to India and joined the Congress Party, and he asked all Indians to strive for independence.
Gandhi's philosophies included civil disobedience, refusal to pay unjust laws.
He fought inequalities of the caste system, especially harsh treatment of untouchables, and he fought for women's rights. He relied on not just Hindu, but on Christian and Western philosophies as well.
Gandhi's work for independence includes boycotts of British goods, especially textiles, work towards making India self-sufficient. The Salt March in 1930 protested British monopoly on salt and salt taxes. Indians were forbidden to make salt. It was a 240-mile march. 78 people started, and the crowd grew into thousands. The world followed news of the march, and England was embarrassed. Salt sellers and protesters were jailed and clubbed. Gandhi's campaign achieved independence in 1947. Muslims called for a separate state, which is now called Pakistan. When World War II erupted in 1939, Britain postponed action on independence and brought India into the war without consulting them. Nationalists launched protests, but millions of Indians ended up helping the war effort. Independence achieved after the war in 1945, and fighting broke out between Hindus and Muslims.
That's all for tonight, folks. We're out.
Welcome to History 101. My name is Julia Ann Smith, and I will be your anchor tonight. We have a very special segment for you, Pakistan, from 1947 to today. Between 1947 and 1956, Pakistan was ruled by two European monarchs. These included George VI and Elizabeth II. Elizabeth continued to rule over Pakistan until it became a parliamentary republic. Unfortunately, a coup was established immediately afterwards by General Ayub Khan. Pakistan experienced economic growth and prosperity under General Khan. This was, of course, until Pakistan went to war with India a second time in 1965, which immediately resulted in bad economics and social instability. Under Ayub Khan's successor, Yahya Khan, interesting in 1965. Which immediately resulted in bad economics and social instability. Under Ayub Khan's successor, Yahya Khan, interesting name, Yahya Khan, in 1969 to 1971, Pakistan underwent a severe cyclone that resulted in the death of 500,000 eastern Pakistan residents.
Thank you, Julia. So, in 1970, Pakistan held its first democratic elections since it gained independence from Great Britain. This was thought to symbolize the transition from the military rule before to a democracy. However, Yahya Khan refused to relinquish his power. This led to civil unrest in the east and finally a coup by the army of Pakistan. This was in order to seek control over the entire province.
Hello and welcome to the Advanced Placement News Network, where we're giving you the news just a lot later. Today, we are going to be covering the Korean War and North Korea. First, you must know why the war began. On September 9th of 1948, Republican South Korea and Communist North Korea, after being strongly opposed to each other during the South Korean elections, decided to claim the countries for themselves and sent troops to the border between the two countries. Now I'm going to hand it off to Gio.
On June 25th, 1950, North Korean troops invaded South Korea, or, as it was known then, the Republic of North Korea. Then in 1951, U.S. troops went into battle for the first time since World War II. For the next 2 years, there will be the bulk of the war, with the truce talk being continuously relocated and moved. Eventually, on June 27th in 1953, an armistice is signed by both sides. Terms call for a large demilitarized zone in between the two countries that is to be patrolled by either side at all times. The U.S. played a large part in this war. The U.S. sent about 90% of its troops to aid South Korea. The U.S. spent around $67 billion on the war. There are more than 7,900 American soldiers still missing in action from the Korean War as of June 2013. In total, the U.S. lost 36,574 people In the war, South Korea lost 217,000 military and 1 million civilians. North Korea lost 406,000 military and 600,000 civilian. And China lost 60,000 military members in the war. Back to you, Nick.
Thank you, Gio. North Korea today is a communist country led by Kim Jong-un. The founder of North Korea, President Kim Il-sung, created the country's policy of self-reliance, which has essentially cut off North Korea economically and diplomatically from the rest of the world, creating it and making it an isolationist country. North Korea has a network of informants who monitor and report to the authorities fellow citizens they suspect of criminal or subversive behavior. Unauthorized access to non-state radio or TV broadcasts is severely punished. Between 150,000 and 200,000 North Koreans live in prison camps, surrounded by electrified fencing. The worst camps are for those who commit political crimes, and offenders can have their entire extended family imprisoned with them. As many as 40% of camp prisoners die from malnutrition while doing mining, logging, and agricultural work with rudimentary tools in harsh conditions. Back to you, Gio.
All legal televisions are tuned to state-controlled domestic programming. The internet does not exist other than a closed domestic network. Few North Koreans know anything about world events apart from how they are described by North Korean propaganda. In 1978, North Korean agents kidnapped South Korean film director Shin Sang-ok and his wife, actress Cho Won-hyu, to create a film industry in North Korea. The couple escaped to the West 8 years later after having made dozens of films. Back to you, Nick.
Nearly all property belongs to the state. A modern independent judicial system does not exist. Religious freedom does not exist. North Korea's regime gets much of its income by exporting to Japan and elsewhere counterfeit pharmaceuticals such as Viagra, narcotics such as methamphetamine, counterfeit cigarettes, and fake 100 US bills. And by selling small arms and missile parts to terror groups and rogue nations. So this is bad. School children provide their own desks and chairs and money to pay for heat. Some students are forced to produce goods for the government, and some parents keep their children home by bribing teachers to keep quiet.
Kim Jong-il, son of the country's founder, has been said by state media to have managed amazing feats. He scored a perfect 300 the first time he went bowling. Hell, I can't get 1 point. And sank 11 holes in one the first time he played golf. North Koreans must abide by one of 28 approved haircuts. Unmarried women must have short hair, but married women have many more options. The hair of young men should be less than 2 inches long. Older men can go as long as 2 3/4. The elder brother to current leader Kim Jong-un, Kim Jong-nam, was passed over to become the heir apparent leader after being arrested in Tokyo in 2001 for traveling to Disneyland on a forged passport. Now back to you, Nick.
That would wrap up our segment about North Korea. Thanks for watching, folks, and good night. Hello, this is the Events Placement News Network news station, and we're bringing you the news just a lot later. Today, we'll be going over the Soviet-Afghan War.
The Soviet-Afghan War was fought in 1980 and was fought in Afghanistan. The war was fought between the Soviet-led Afghan forces and the rebel Mujahideen. The Mujahideen had 200,000 to 250,000 soldiers, while the Soviets had 115,000 Soviet troops and 55,000 Afghan troops for a combined total of 170,000 soldiers.
Two major military groups made up the Mujahideen. One of those two groups is called the Peshawar 7, and they received military training in Pakistan and China. The second major group was the Tehran 8, and the Tehran 8 was receiving support from the Republic of Islam. The Mujahideen received billions of dollars from the United States, United Kingdoms, and Saudi Arabia.
The Illinois president had deployed the 40th Army into Afghanistan. This is why the Afghan soldiers were able to put up a good fight. The 40th Army became the core of the Soviet occupational force in Afghanistan. The 40th Army was first formed during World War II. The 40th Army was formed during the German invasion of the Soviet Union, codenamed Operation Barbarossa. The first time that the 40th Army went into battle, it was shattered. The 40th Army reformed, and after that it was a force to be reckoned with. With this in mind, the Mujahideen still went to war with the Soviet-led Afghan troops.
The war ended when Mikhail Gorbachev became the leader of Russia on February 15, 1989. Over the course of the war, the Soviets lost 14,553 men, and their Afghan forces lost 18,000. Only 9,500 Soviet losses were due to battle, and the rest were from wounds and diseases. 4,000 died from wounds, and 1,000 died from disease and accidents. The Mujahideen lost 75,000 and 90,000 soldiers. 300 Pakistani soldiers were killed over the course of the war. Millions of civilians fled from Afghanistan to Pakistan and Iran. The war claimed hundreds of thousands of Afghan civilian lives.
Thanks for tuning in to the Advanced Placement News Network, and we'll see you next time for another news report.
Hello. I'm Sophia.
I'm Ella. Today we are discussing the current affairs in Vietnam. Vietnam has been under French and Japanese rule for up to 6 decades and... Copy that. We've received word that the French and Japanese power over Vietnam has been breached. The French have requested that...
At the Potsdam Conference, the French have requested the return of all French pre-war colonies in Southeast Asia.
Indochina.
This request was granted, making Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia French colonies once again.
After this took place, the U.S. intervened in an effort to keep South Vietnam from communism. The Northeast forces, formerly known as Viet Cong, were led by Ho Chi Minh, a communist activist who...
He attempted to negotiate full independence and unity for Vietnam, but failed to obtain any guarantee from the French.
He had earlier established Viet Minh, a headquarters in northern Vietnam, settled in a cave, whose goal was to rid Vietnam of the French and Japanese occupiers. He also created a new government called the Democratic Republic of Vietnam.
The French were not willing to give up their colony and were defeated at Dien Bien Phu.
Phu?
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 Phu. Phu.
Phu.
Forcing them to pull out of Vietnam.
At the Geneva Conference, the U.S., Britain, Soviet Union, France, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos met to determine the withdrawal. The Geneva Accords resulted in the division of Vietnam in two. Ho Chi Minh's communist forces ceded the north,
while the Bao Dai regime was granted the south. Here, elections were able to take place. However, I must break it to you that these events that led up to this were costly, not only economically, but through the lives of our troops. Over 58,000 of our soldiers were killed.
It was a real tragedy.
Thank
you. Stay classy, Vietnam.
Hello, everybody. Your host, E. Brown here. Thanks for tuning in to Mech Live. Today we will discuss the Arab-Israeli conflict that occurred in the 20th century and still affects the world today. What is the Arab-Israeli conflict, you may ask? Well, it was a series of wars fought between the Jewish state of Israel and the surrounding Islamic countries. Please welcome our two very intelligent guests. Ladies and gentlemen, get ready. Get ready, CJ and Morgie! Yay! Woo!
Howdy, so I'm CJ. My first question is, why are these wars fought?
Yo, Morgie in the house. What? Well, CJ, these wars are fought over religion. Political and economic disagreements brought the world's attention to the problem. However, religion was the main cause for the conflict.
Did this affect other nations?
The Israelis wanted to keep the Jewish state of Israel, but Arabs did not want that to happen. The Israelis kicked out the Arabs from Israel. The Arabs were very angry and sent armies to kill the Israelis. The Israelis never attacked, but they were defending themselves. Israelis wanted peace, and the Arabs wanted to fight back and take their land. The entire conflict derived from differences in the religions of Judaism and Islam. Both wanted to obtain power.
Who were important leaders? Yo.
The Camp David Accords was a meeting between President Jimmy Carter, the President of Egypt, Anwar el-Sadat, and Prime Minister Menachem begin, where they agreed on the Jewish population having the Jewish state of Israel. This was important because Egypt was an Arab nation, with its leader supporting the Israelis. Sadat was later assassinated.
What else went down?
A major effect of this conflict was an increase in Arab nationalism. Each individual had a common enemy, their suppressors, the Israelis. In fact, the Arab nations initiated 4 wars against Israel: the 1948 Wars of Independence, the 1956 Sinai War, the 1967 Six-Day War, and the 1973 Yom Kippur War. These tensions remain today.
What happened throughout these wars? What?
Actually, Israel won each time. They were able to defend themselves and displayed their drive for peace and independence.
Stay tuned to hear a discussion about the Cuban Revolution after a short commercial break. Woo! Welcome back, everybody. As promised, we will dive right into the Cuban Revolution. Who wants to tell me what in the world the Cuban Revolution was?
I'll help you out, E. Brown. The Cuban Revolution was in 1958 and was a political revolution that removed the United States from economic sovereignty in Cuba. Cuba no longer wanted to trade with the U.S., which is called embargo.
Also, Fulgencio Batista was removed from power because he continued on to business with the U.S. that only benefited the rich people of Cuba. The revolution was led by Fidel Castro, who became the new leader of Cuba as a communist dictator.
What was the Spanish-American War?
That was the beginning of Cuba as an independent nation. The Spanish lost to America in the Spanish-American War. The Treaty of Paris stated that the Spanish could no longer control Cuba and Puerto Rico. The United States gained the Philippines. What?
So then what was the actual revolution?
Throughout the first half of the 20th century, the United States had a strong influence in Cuba. In 1933, Batista took control of Cuba, and although achieved political stability, the economy of Cuba was a disaster. In 1959, a rebellion led by Fidel Castro overthrew Batista and is referred to as the Cuban Revolution. Castro's military was mostly made up of Cuban working class and soundly defeated Batista's army. Upon taking power, Castro gained the support of the Soviet Union in economic matters and political protection from the United States, as displayed in the Cuban propaganda poster.
World focus was placed on conditions in Latin America after Castro began supporting rebellious movements in Bolivia, Colombia, Nicaragua, and El Salvador. The communist government of Cuba is still intact today under the leadership of Castro.
What about the United States? What's the explanation behind the embargo between Cuba and U.S.?
About 2 years ago, after Batista was removed from power and communism came about the country, the U.S. stopped trade with Cuba.
Well, that's interesting.
That's a lot of great information to take in. Well, that's a wrap for us. Tune in next time to Mech Live for a special on World War II. Good night, everybody. Have a sparkly day.
Howdy, so I'm CJ. My first question is, why were these wars fought? Come on.
Really?
Turn it off. Stop. You're still... I need the microphone.
Morgan, whoa! Alright. Okay. Religion, political and economic disagreements brought the world's attention to the problem. However, religion was the main cause of the conflict. The end.
We fell in love as the leaves turn brown in the sun. In the summer, we fell in love.